YouTube? It's Dr. Caesar. I'm back with a different type of video today. I'm going to be talking about American capitalism through the eyes of a doctor. There's been a lot about business practices, inequality, the concentration of wealth in the hands of very few in the news lately, especially sort of during this pandemic. And one of the things that we really don't think about is think about business as sort of a living entity. But what if American capitalism, our set of business practices, uh, can be compared to a living entity? Is there something going wrong with um, that body, if you will? And when we take care of patients in the hospital, we have to look at all parts equally. We have to look, if someone is confused, you have to rule out kidney dysfunction or other organ dysfunction. And there's a way that we're trained to specifically do those things. American capitalism, our set of principles, ethics, and corporate infrastructure is no different than a human body. When we think about the history of American capitalism, we must examine its genetic construct, sort of the rules that generate the nucleus of this business culture. So I start out by talking about the theory of maximizing profits. So maximizing profits for investors is a central statute. It's like a guiding principle that American private companies adhere to, and it's universally accepted. In theory, it makes sense. You got to make money in order to survive and pass along those profits, the wealth to your workers. And so if we think about a corporation as a living entity, those profits should benefit the entirety of that living body. Sort of like our brain. Our brain cannot survive without the stability and health of other parts of the body. Ideally, a company should return a portion of those profits to its workers. Makes sense. There should be a balance between the brain, body, workers, and executives. So how does the statute of maximizing profits contribute to a corporation's long-term health? What happens when a company just says, okay, this is our statute, this is what we're going to do, and it's what the companies have been doing for the last, like, since World War II, basically, especially after the 1970s. What has happened? So economists have sort of broken this down already. We already have a study of patients, if you will, to study what the effects of this sort of implementation of this thinking has done. Thomas Piketty is one of the best renowned economists in the world, and he's written very influential books. One of them is one of the largest books in the that's made a big impact in the subject, Capital in the 21st Century. One of Piketty's central arguments is that economic inequality is a consequence of capitalism. So what happens is this leads to a concentration of wealth in the hands of very few. When companies generate wealth, instead of those earnings sort of coming down to its workers, which has sort of been described by Reaganomics, with trickling down theory, and the theory of when people thought about, okay, well, we're going to maximize profits, and if we do that, then the whole company's gonna benefit. But that hasn't happened, and there's hard, cold evidence to prove that. From 2007 to 2016, what we've examined that these corporations, especially like the most successful ones, they don't spend that money on workers' wages or innovation. They spend it on ballooning their own self-worth. So how do you balloon or inflate your self-worth? You buy your own stocks, because if you buy your own stocks, then the value of your company is going to go up, and then that's going to drive up your profits. So very little of these workers' wages, even though workers contribute to the generation of wealth in a company, very little of those profits went down to workers. It's a great article here that breaks this down. and I have the links. You click on the link. The curse of stock buyback. So this has been making the rounds lately uh, in the news, especially when we hear about companies being bailed out, and you're like, okay, well, didn't you have enough money to save? With your quarterly profits, and it's amazing how multi-billion-dollar companies are already asking for handouts in a matter of weeks. So from 2007 to 2016, stock repurchases by 461 of S&P 500 companies totaled $4 trillion, equal to 54% of profits. But what happens is the following. Corporate executives are often willing to take on corporate debt, even terminate employees, reduce wages, sell assets, and diminish cash reserves to do buybacks. So it becomes almost like a self-serving entity. It becomes separate from the actual core identity of the company or the product. It's almost like profits takes on a life of its own. Ironically, what Piketty is describing with the social inequality is something that we see in the hospital regularly. He's describing a human body that's been hijacked by a rogue group of cells or a tumor at the expense of the rest of the body. Cancer, in its biological basis, represents the unregulated growth of cells. We normally have a checks and balances system, and most of the cancer that arises from mutations. Some of it's hereditary, and whenever there's in our cells, whenever there's an unregulated, there's a mutation that leads to unregulated growth. Usually, the human body can regulate that growth and eliminate sort of those mutations. But when it can't, then an imbalance occurs, and then that tumor grows, and then it creates a burden for the rest of the body, and eventually the body's drained of nutrition, its immunity, and then you need medical therapy, whether it's chemotherapy or surgery. The inevitable consequence is death if no regulation of this inequality in cellular growth occurs. So, like the human body, a corporation suffers the same fate. What happens if a corporation just continues to prioritize profits, short-term thinking, and this ballooning of its own worth just by looking at profits? Well, we know what happens. And recently, there has been sort of this closer examination at firms. So what happens is when U.S. firms become short-oriented, there is this is a paper published in 2019 from Georgetown University. There is a clear sort of association with a lack of innovation and long-term growth, because all of a sudden these companies, it's their obligation to shareholders, they say, and so an inevitable consequence is that instead of taking a risk and investing those profits into workers' wages or innovations, well, why not just put it in the in the stock market, or why not buy our own stocks? That is a sure way of sort of ballooning our own worth and adhering to our shareholders, our investors. Economic research has clearly shown that short-term thinking kills innovation and threatens the sustainability of a company's long-term survivability and health. We have a diagnosis, so what do we do? What's next? If a corporation's fatal illness is a hyper-focused on profits, is there an alternative? Well, there is, and Europe has been doing this since World War II. The majority of European countries, for example, have these rules that are implemented in corporate, they call them corporate governance rules, which is basically if you run a corporation, you have these set of rules that these principles that I had mentioned earlier, one of them being shareholder dominance. But they have something where that corporation's leadership board is represented by workers. So they mandate that workers, the people who are actually on the manufacturing line, the people that are contributing to the wealth of the actual the company, have representation on the leadership boards. So this is sort of a restoration of power and balance. And there have been think tanks, progressive think tanks in the United States, that have called for this sort of restoration of balance. In his latest book, Thomas Piketty arrives at the same conclusion. He calls for a change in corporate leadership practice to sort of mirror what European countries are doing. Germany, for example, when a German company goes above 2,000 employees, 50% of that executive leadership board must be from workers. The inevitable conclusion by European countries, countries like Germany, Sweden as well, the Roosevelt Institute and Piketty is the same. You need to excise this cancerous, malignant thinking of profit prioritization at the expense of your workers' wages and innovation, and also the surrounding sort of obligations that companies have to their communities. Because remember, a company can't just come out of nowhere. A company needs the laws and the stability of a society to be born from that genetic construct. So a company arises from they benefit from from the rules, from the taxes that those citizens made available for that sort of platform. An example is like any Silicon Valley company that uses the internet, just every single one of them, for its business practice has a societal debt. And some people may call this an ethical sort of argument, but the internet its research was largely founded or was largely based on taxpayer money. A lot of the technology engineering that went into the discovery of the internet was from the U.S. military. We contribute immensely. The U.S. military is completely dependent on U.S. taxpayer money. And so if a company is born out of that DNA, shouldn't it remain continuously in tune with society? That's what I mean by societal benefits. A balanced executive board with healthy representation of workers is like a living cell with proteins able to regulate and eliminate DNA mutations. Because all of a sudden, once you have a corporate board with workers, then you have a different perspective, right? You have a different perspective in that corporate leadership board. You're like, we're not going to sacrifice our safety for just chasing that quick buck in the short run. At its core, what these examples all have in common is a theme of balanced representation, a universal truism that's seen in the biological world. Any biological entity needs balance, whether it's individually, whether it's a cell that's part of a body or an organ or a single living entity, or whether it's an entity living within the ecology of its surrounding species. You need this sort of balance exists. If there's an imbalance, then either death happens or there's just tyranny. The whole surrounding ecology turns on that person. A balance must be struck in order to maintain the needs and demands of workers and surrounding communities. By prioritizing profits, a corporation's genetic construct mutates into something else, like a tumor. And one of the best examples of sort of having these workers, what we call stakeholder representation, came out with the new Michael Jordan series. So the new Michael Jordan series, that's a take on his career, sort of this documentary, is called The Last Dance. And Michael Jordan actually talks about how at the end of winning one of his championships, he talks about how the executive leadership of his organization, the Chicago Bulls, the basketball team he plays for, needs to pay attention and respect the input of the workers, the NBA players, because they have themselves contributed to the overall wealth. The reason he was bringing this up is because there was a lot of disconnect with the executive leadership and the workers. The Bulls wouldn't be anything of if it wasn't for MJ and his hard, his work ethic. And there needs to be a balance. And we see that with a lot of NBA players now. We're talking about the sort of greater voice that they're advocating for when it comes to their overall representation of power within an organization. And MJ breaks this down. But what's interesting is that this is one of the most watched documentaries, and he's sort of foreshadowing this battle in capitalism, which is the shareholder, the investor profits versus the stakeholder workers debate.
Deals on it.
Michael, obviously, in
So
the
they're
way
asking him right here before I start. They're asking him about the problems in the sort of that are happening in the executive sort of board. Even though he just won a championship, it's like he just won a championship. He brought literally probably hundreds of millions to the Bulls organization, and it's disrespectful because his contributions to the wealth of the organization are not being acknowledged at all. So let's see.
of this incredible celebration, there'll be some very difficult business decisions.
We're entitled to defend what we have until we lose it. If we lose it, then you look at it and you say, okay, let's change. Let's just go through a rebuilding. No one's guaranteeing rebuilding is going to be 2 or 3, 4, 5 years. Cubs have been rebuilding for 42 years. If you want to look at this from a business thing, have a sense of respect for the people who have laid the groundworks so that you could be a profitable organization.
It's really foretelling and powerful what he says. Have a sense of respect for the people who put in the work, because you could take MJ's statement and apply it to any enterprise, any corporation, any business model. And, he's describing exactly what Europe has been doing, what Germany has been doing, what Piketty is calling for, what progressive, capitalists are advocating for. And this was 20 years ago. So it's an example that transcends really any field of corporate or business practice, whether it's sports, healthcare, Silicon Valley, it doesn't matter. You need to represent workers in the overall, in the leadership sort of aspect of a corporation in order to maintain the stability and the long-term health of that company. And all right, I hope that was interesting, and I hope that was something a little different, educational. Again, the link is below. Appreciate it. And if you guys have any questions, reach out. All right.